Great. So I'm standing in for Suhail this term to host the RPG talks. And Suhail's prepared this incredible series for us, and it's called Augmentation. And it's looking at how digital augmentation is changing everything. Computation and data are increasingly and pervasively environmentalized, becoming intimate, and new forms of governmentality and power emerge through the cyberneticization of societies and metaversing of cyberspace. Many of us live our lives, of course, 24/7, tethered to our phones or to Web3, and we have these token spaces emerging. At the same time, bio and nano and infotech, machine learning, data environments, and cognitive sciences increasingly mutate and rapidly transform worlds, augmenting realities through datification processes that track, measure, interpolate, financialize, and store precipitous excesses of information. And increasingly, artists and cultural institutions are intervening in developing new tactics, skills, and complex transdisciplinary assemblages to engage the augmenting strata of these techno-ecologies. The augmentation theme is a way to think about long-term consequences of the move to the online art model accelerated by lockdown, and it questions how to develop this more systemically, consequentially, rather than as a default process or business as usual. The augmentation series started last week with a discussion of impending transformations of art systems from Eva Jager and Victoria Ivanova. And we now move to a critical examination of NFTs, DAOs, blockchains, and then later we'll conclude in this series thinking about automation technologies and real world applications. And this series is an introduction to these issues without presuming prior knowledge or particular understanding of it. And the usual format is for the speaker to present a fairly conversational talk for about 40, 50, 60 minutes. And then we have about 20 to 30 minutes discussion with you. And I'll help field your questions at the end through the chat. So use the chat to put in your name and your course and your year. And if you have questions there as well for Wassim, that's the spot to do it. So yeah, today we have Wassim and his talk, JPEGing the Question, Histories and Futures of Immateriality, which throws shade on the non-fungible token world while acknowledging its support for creators in a post-pandemic world. Next week, we have Anna Engelhardt, Augmented Infrastructures at War. On the 30th of May, Wassim will be back together with Jana Clara Becker with their talk, Decentralization Theater. And then on the 6th of June, we have Xiaowai Wang, Accounting for Accountability in Rural China. And now I'm going to introduce Wassim. He's the founder and convener of the OX Salon, which conducts experiments in post-disciplinary collective knowledge practices. A veteran of the blockchain space, Wassim specializes in the conceptual design and philosophy of peer-to-peer or P2P systems. He's contributed to numerous publications, has an editorial column at the MIT Computational Law Report, and he co-founded MIT's Interdisciplinary Cryptoeconomic Systems Journal and Conference Series. Prior to MIT, he was an independent researcher formulating novel approaches to the characterization of cryptographic assets and networks, such as, let's see here, Regulatory Epistemology Project, Token Space. Wassim has curated art festivals, led a sculptural engineering laboratory, and published experimental music, improvisatory theater, poetry, and speculative scripture. Building upon research specializations in the natural science, Wassim also holds a PhD in ultra-fast supermolecular photophysics from the University of Nottingham, alongside degrees in chemistry, astrophysics, and finance. His talk tonight, JPEGing the Question, asks who are the winners and losers in the brave new non-fungible world? Do crypto believers' calls promising emancipation for creatives who work has long been underpaid hold any water? Without much further ado, I'm just going to hand it over to Wassim.
Yeah, thanks very much, y'all. Hey, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Also, thanks to Sahel for inviting me. It's a shame that he can't be here. I'm very sorry about that. But yeah, without any further ado, yeah, thanks very much for having me here. And yeah, I'm going to talk you through some work that I've been doing, principally in the last, let's say, 6 to 9 months. We've been putting together a sense-making process about this very intense and sudden shift and sudden rise to prominence and shift in economic activity in the realm of digital art using cryptographic tokens on site, on top of blockchains and stuff like that. So this talk doesn't, as Yol said, doesn't assume any prior knowledge. I'm not going to talk that much about kind of like what is a blockchain and kind of stuff. But yeah, I'll just try to give a very broad survey of what's happening in the space and try to give some kind of hooks for ideas, questions, provocations in there. There's going to be more questions than answers because we're very much in the eye of the storm of all of this stuff still. Like it's still happening as we're talking about it. So it's quite hard to characterize these things as they're evolving very quickly. But yes, so what we're trying to do, the subtitle of the talk is Histories and Futures of Immateriality. What we're trying to do is connect the past of conceptual art, as it's concerned with immateriality, to the present moment of these kind of cryptographic metaphysical objects. And yeah, so without any further ado, let's roll in. Yeah, so this is the outline of what we're going to talk about, and we'll be coming back to this as we go through. So yeah, just very quickly, because y'all already gave a very kind introduction, just to say really little bit about myself. So I started off as physics, chemistry, maths kind of person, but I was always doing music and art alongside, principally as a hobby. And then yeah, in my mid-20s, I finished my PhD. And thought there might be more to life than living in a room without any windows. Because when you do laser research, you can't have reflective surfaces in the room. So I was literally in the dark my whole 20s. So that wasn't the best way to spend my youth, but that's how it went. So I was also started a record label, and I was kind of a touring experimental electronic musician. And yeah, from the pictures on the middle slide is a disused mining facility at a experimental art festival in Sweden that I used to curate called Norberg Festival. And that's now back after the pandemic. If you're looking for a holiday, it's in early July. I also took some kind of weird art projects to places like the Tate Modern and Pompidou. These are kind of like musical sculptures in the center of the screen. And yeah, it was through music that I kind of, through kind of a glitch in space of time, found this crypto stuff about 10 years ago. So I was touring with a couple of artists from my label on the west coast of the United States, California. And we were in San Francisco. One of the musicians I was with said, hey, let's go visit my buddy. He's doing an internship at Intel. So we got in the car, drove from San Francisco to Santa Clara, visited this fellow who was living in a shoebox in Silicon Valley. And he opened his closet door, his cupboard door, and said, check this out. I'm doing this thing called mining Bitcoin. And this was spring 2013. And at that point, I was just like, what's that? And he explained it to me, but he explained it in a very negative way, because the power in California, even before the recent kind of electricity price surges, was always very high. And so this guy was burning electricity to make these coins, and they weren't worth very much 10 years ago. Bitcoin was like a science experiment back then. And so he was just full of, loathing for this thing. He wasn't very happy with his decisions. But I saw something a bit different in these technologies. And I think that might be because of my background. So my family's Iraqi in origin, and they had a lot of political and economic problems with the kind of dictatorial regime in the 70s and 80s over there. And so he kind of lost everything, having to leave the country very suddenly. And so the idea of a digital asset, which can't be taken away from you, can't be confiscated, you can't be prevented from using it, that immediately spoke to me. And I kind of went down this gradual rabbit hole, year after year, getting more and more interested, more and more involved in characterizing and understanding the space, both the technology and the people around it, as a supporter, as somebody that saw an emancipatory and liberatory potential here. And I've kind of come out the other side now, where I'm coming now from a place of skepticism, where I see that, the promises of a lot of these things haven't been borne out of the realities that we've seen thus far. And I think we'll also see that, in particular with reference to this token art stuff that we're going to talk about today. But yeah, so I was an independent researcher trying to get a job at a UK university for 18 months. I wrote 15 applications and I got 0 interviews. And just by somehow, I wrote an application to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I got the job to start their blockchain journal in 2019. So I was working over there for 18 months, founding this journal. And my job was kind of, as well as doing all the kind of boring stuff, the spreadsheets and the emails, chasing people around, really my job was to try and help cement a new discipline, new academic field, by being this kind of epistemic go-between between kind of mathematics and cryptography, politics and social science, economics, law, all the rest of it. And so I think that kind of stood me in quite good stead for dipping my toes in the art world recently, which I'm not really from and I'm not really that familiar with. I keep telling everybody I don't know anything about art, but people just stop, they haven't listened to me anyway. And so I am currently now running a different journal, or editing a different journal at the MIT Media Lab. And this one's called the MIT Computational Law Report. You will notice it has the word law in it, but my biography does not contain any law. So yes, I'm an editor at a law journal, knowing nothing about the law. And I think the reason I'm there is because where like technology is driving law is towards a lot of the technology governance questions and issues that we've been exploring in the blockchain space over the last decade or so. So I imagine it's more because of where the law is going that is of interest there. So yeah, I write about governance, about how we make rules to decide what happens in these peer-to-peer networks that don't have authorities in them. And yeah, I'll just say something about the Salon. So the 0x Salon is a collective, artist-run collective that we started in Berlin a few years ago to start the pandemic. And it basically centers around an event series of these kind of like intimate discourse sessions, like between 15 and 25 people. We pick out topics, which I'll show you in a moment, and we talk them through. And so a community formed around this quite organically. We started writing both kind of epistemic, pedagogical, but also creative outputs, reflections, provocations based on the conversations. And one of those topics we explored was NFTs. As it became a hot topic in the mid to late 2020. So we did some salons, we recorded a podcast, and then I started writing a little bit more about that. And here's just a flavor of some of the topics that we talk about at the salon. I won't go too far into this because there's quite a lot for us to get through that's more relevant. But you can go to 0xsalon.pubpub.org if you're interested in looking around, finding out a bit more. So I think a lot of this started when I wrote a poem called "The Revolution Will Not Be Tokenized," which got published in a queer, anti-Orientalist feminist magazine based in Berlin last year called Auham. And I just feel like maybe I'll read you a little bit of this. Like this is just one of these kind of very angular, obtuse, poetic critiques. Where shall we start? Let's start from the start. So the first stanza is called Equity and Equitability. The tragedy of the communes, epistemic black markets, a bonfire for all the profanities, the thesis of Theseus, maison d'etre, apocryphal now, exit through the grift shop, live in Davida lockdown. Now, I won't read more of it. You can see the stuff on the screen. It's also online. But in there are some of the critiques and some of the pointed observations that we're going to unpack in more detail in the rest of the talk. And as I understand, the lecture series is roughly around lessons learned from the pandemic. And I would say that the key operator here is maison d'etre, the play on words from raison d'etre. And so the idea that the home is the site of existence, which I think is one of the reasons we've seen this NFT moment in the last couple of years. As I said, we'll elaborate on that in just a minute. And so, about 6 months ago, I was asked to write the feature essay in Spike Art Magazine's Web3 issue, which came out, I think, in January or so. And so I wrote an article with the same title, "The Revolution Will Not Be Tokenized," as the poetry you saw earlier. And what we're going to go through for the rest of the hour is the rough exposition that's between that article and a related one, which was in an online discourse, crypto art discourse journal called Right Click Save. And so, I think, y'all just started, reading some of this or pointing towards some of this. And I thought, that's quite a good jumping off point for us. So we all see this, massive seismic shift has occurred in the art world, in finance, and many other places. And we're just trying to make sense of this thing, in the rearview mirror, in the wake of it, I suppose. So who are the winners and losers in this brave new non-fungible world? Why should we give in to the hype, spectacle, and speculation to tokenize everything? Do crypto believers' calls, promising emancipation for long-suffering creatives, hold water? What of unpleasant histories and inconvenient truths glossed over in the midst of a digital gold rush? Then as now, value, uniqueness, and authenticity matter, both for material and immaterial forms of art. Beyond technical roadblocks and conceptual learning curves, questions around power, control, and fairness linger. The conversation around possession and participation is treacherous, littered with unpassable moats and gatekeeping grifters. Digital utopias in the ruins of our planet. We can surely imagine it so. But is this new world actually fairer than the old? So that's, hopefully there's some food for thought in there. I hope you all have opinions on these things as well. Feel free to take me to task if you aren't pleased with what I come up with between now and the end of the talk. And so, let's jump in. Finally, let's talk about it. So NFTs, what are they? And, this is a acronym, and there's 3 components of the acronym. So let's unpack those. So the first one is it's 2, I suppose it's hyphenated. It's idea of fungibility. And this is not a new concept. It's been around for a very long time. And you could pretty much reduce it down to interchangeability or equivalency. But one set of things is like another set of things. So I put my wallet away. I was about to get my wallet and show you some banknotes. I'm in Denmark at the moment. I was going to pick out some 100 crown notes, and they are pretty much the same as each other. You can pick out some £5 notes from your pocket if you like. They're pretty much the same as each other. They're pretty much fungible. They're pretty much exchangeable and identical if you ignore the serial number on the banknotes, because that then does distinguish them as unique. But if we just ignore that for a moment, or we could think about the 20p coins in your pocket, they're all pretty much the same. Even if they were made in different years, they might have a different design on them. They're pretty much equivalent. You wouldn't notice the difference if somebody swapped one for the other largely. And the etymology of this word, fungibility, comes from fungi, to perform and to function. So we talked about cash being fungible. I would say that also something that's really useful to bear in mind at this early stage is that fungibility is not a binary phenomenon. As with so many things these days, we're realizing it's a spectrum. And so things can become more or less fungible, depending on how, the degree of uniqueness or the degree of identifiability, the degree of separability. And so things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, this was kind of one of the real innovations of blockchain technology, unquestionable ones. There's plenty of arguable ones. One unquestionable one is it gave us a way to easily verify the nature of scarce digital objects, who has them, where they came from, what they are, how many of them you have, and so on. And what NFTs are doing is taking this idea of digital scarcity that the blockchain and cryptocurrencies kind of instantiated and leveraging uniqueness. The idea of this non-fungibility is then bringing uniqueness to this digital scarcity. And I'm sure, before we even go any further, you can imagine why the art world has seen kind of utility in this. And on the right is I believe that's a Sumerian or Babylonian stone tablet from my forebears. And this is a land sale contract. So Yol and I are exchanging some land. And, this is the deed This is the token that keeps the record. And so we've been using technologies to keep record of, the change in status, the change in value, the change in ownership of objects for thousands of years. And this is yet one of the latest ways of doing that. So you can see it as an incremental advance in that sense. Okay, the tokens bit. Tokens are also nothing new, as we just saw. That clay tablet is a token as well. And we're using these things for record keeping, for memorializing myths, debts, grudges. Maybe some of you have seen the very famous copper tablet of Ian Nazir that has been going around the internet over the last 12 months. It is a complaint about the delivery of the wrong grade of copper from Babylon. And so these are kind of pretty timeless questions of transaction, timeless needs that humans have to keep records, to remember scores and to settle them. And so, putting that all together, we can see NFTs as kind of cryptographic accounting units, in a sense. You can also think of them as a claim on ownership, on access and use, either of the digital asset itself or something that it represents. You could imagine an NFT as a key to get you into, let's say, a virtual space, a real space, to give you access to a service or something like that. So one of the most helpful lenses to think about NFTs, especially in this art context, in the context of the art object, is as a signature or a certificate of authenticity. And we'll go into some of the interesting precedents and prior art of that. But one thing I want to point you to before we get too far is the picture on the right of a tweet by this artist stroke prankster, Neither Confirm. And what they've done is they issued an NFT project. This is all to prove a point. They issued an NFT project, which was a bunch of kind of crypto bro influencer, their avatars all posterized or whatever. And they put that on the market and people did whatever they did with that. And because a lot of the time, especially on these more popular marketplaces like OpenSea, very often you've got the object and it's just pointing. It's literally just a link, almost like a URL to either something that's on the web or it's on some kind of permanent storage on a blockchain. And what he did was he just changed the image that the pointer was pointing to, and he changed it to a bunch of Oriental rugs. And the reason for that is that we have this kind of crypto lingo in the blockchain space of the rug pull. You also have it in finance a little bit. The idea, you've probably all seen those kind of pranks where there's a nice dinner table, all set, fancy, crystal, everything. And somebody comes and removes the tablecloth and sort of, kind of whips it from underneath everything. And if they do it right, nothing gets smashed. So that's kind of the rug being pulled from under the feet of the things on the table. And this is what this person is trying to show here with the rug pull, is that you don't own necessarily the object or the aesthetic representation of the art. That what the ownership is in question of here is more to do with the object. The object here is the cryptographic object rather than the creative object. And so we'll come back to this a little bit later. The NFTs are kind of bringing in this interesting kind of tension, or maybe even the nail in the coffin, the final divorce of a commodity object from an art object. And so here's some Baudrillard, which I try to shoehorn some Baudrillard into every talk. I find him to be extremely relevant these days. And here's a part from the new edition of Symbolic Exchange and Death, which I'm going to read to you because I think it has something for us in this kind of NFT moment that we're seeing. We now live in a world dominated by the free play of the monetary sign that is beyond reference to any reel of production or even a monetary referent in the form of a gold standard. In this world, the idea of a real value of equities, of commodities, of houses, of anything is meaningless, as what matters instead is not value per se, but infinite speculation. This new world is marked by the emergence of a brothel of capital, not for prostitution, but for substitution and commutation. So this is kind of pointing that we're in a world of semiotic value, a domain of semiotic value creation, rather than kind of raw materials and labor being acted upon things. We seem to be in kind of like other domain entirely right now. So I just want to step to one side and say something really quickly about Web3 before we launch specifically into kind of token art and digital art stuff. So Web3 is kind of a buzzword which you've probably been hearing quite a lot of recently. And it's kind of an umbrella term. It kind of encompasses a lot of the various things that we're seeing in the crypto space, principally things outside of Bitcoin. So the more kind of like featureful, application rich stuff. And like for our purposes, I guess we can lump NFTs, non-fungible tokens, DeFi, decentralized finance, and DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, into this kind of rubric of Web3, where the ideas would, the cheerleaders say we're building a new internet here, an internet of ownership, where you have a stake in the protocols. Now, there's lots of kind of things to be said about that, but I won't go too deep in because otherwise we'll get a little bit lost in details. But just to say, this is kind of like a jumping off point for a salon that we did not so long ago. And I'm going to read you a little bit of the provocation from one of the salon's residents, Alice Yuan Zhang. And so this is about DAOs, which are kind of like crypto organizations. So we're now building kind of organizational logics on the blockchain. And these organizations are now kind of amassing treasuries. They have like quite a lot of economic power. Many of these DAOs are collecting art. So you might have heard of some of these: Fingerprints DAO, Bryant Moments DAO, and there's plenty more. Anyway, in the 6 years between the notorious exploit of the DAO, which was the first experiment in this domain, which ended in a catastrophe, to today, more than 4,000 groups and over $8 billion in treasuries bear witness to a feverish rise to prominence of DAOs. And these are on-chain treasuries operated by member token voting mechanisms and group chats like Discord. People are using these things for applications, everything from NFT creators and collectors to financialized lending pools. Somebody even tried to break the carbon market with the KlimaDAO, tried to kind of break the kind of speculative, turn the carbon market into a Ponzi scheme, pretty much. And so we have these ideas of scaling these things up whilst maintaining transparency, security, and community ownership. But I would say that the world we're creating, as you'll see with NFTs, you probably already are aware, is not an equal one. We're not building an egalitarian world in Web3 as yet, anyway. Okay, so let's say something about immateriality, objects and production. Now, I am fully aware that I am very much trespassing outside of my domain of expertise when I talk about the history of art. And so I really look forward to better examples, or even pointing out mistakes or inconsistencies in what I'm presenting here today. So please don't hold back if I make mistakes. Please tell me. So the way I see it from my outsider's view is that the art world is very much a scarcity based. It operates on the logics of scarcity. We see a lot of exclusion and elitism, at least in the way the art world seems to work today. The objects that are traded as part of the art industry, let's say, art market, are desired, valued, and traded based on this exclusivity of access, of ownership, of association. And it seems that understanding the value that markets place on things is hard enough with fungible objects like currencies or commodities. But when you have non-fungible objects, relatively unique, it's always been hard in the art market to determine the fair price of something. And so there's nothing new here. We see this kind of soft concepts, like capital concepts, sociocultural ones, and hard ones seem to go into this process of creating the art object, giving it value, and creating this tradable form that people wish to collect, hoard, speculate, and exhibit. And so the art world's always needed ways to keep track of things right? We've got these objects floating around, being housed in collections, museums, going around for different shows. And so, yeah, understanding provenance and like having a way to verify authenticity. Like we have all these problems with fakes being discovered in museums, for example, ownership, conditions of a work storage, how it was transported, displayed, transactions. NFTs can make all these things much easier compared to what we had before. And so it's not hard to see why people are excited by using these technologies in this kind of like certification and this kind of like record keeping manner. And so here's something you're probably mostly familiar with. This is like a little bit of early conceptual art, I suppose, or at least the mid 20th century conceptual art. This is Yves Klein doing the Zone de Sensibilité Picturale Immatérielle, where they were selling cubes of empty space. And you had to, you get a certificate with them signed by the artist. And there was a special ritual which the artist would do to destroy your object by putting it in the Seine, putting it in the river, excuse me, alongside half of the gold that you had put down. So there's something here, I think, which points the way towards where our moment that we're in now, where we kind of divorced the materiality of the art object from the creative endeavor, and also from the market logics. And so I think this is something that kind of squares, or like brings us full circle, which is Sotheby's, the famous auctioneers, was selling one of the certificates, the Yves Klein certificates. And what's interesting is they were selling it, they were accepting cryptocurrency for it. So I feel like there's kind of an interesting, loop, closing of the loop here. And you could also notice that the lot was sold for 2 to 4 times the reserve, which suggests to me that a crypto bro probably bought it with their appreciated tokens. That's what I imagine. So there's an artist called Mitchell Chan that has been working both inside and outside the blockchain space, producing art, using digital and also non-digital means and approaches. And he's been playing on this, the Yves Klein idea. This is from 2017, by the way, kind of the early days of NFTs and token art, relatively early days, let's say. And so, yeah, there've also been kind of projects linking this kind of Yves Klein immateriality, the marketization of immateriality, to blockchain logics. And yes, another great example, which I like to draw on, is SolidWit and the algorithmic instructions for wall drawings. So what I think is interesting, as you see on the left here, is that it's the instructions that are numbered and signed by the artist here, not the outputs, not the diagrams that the algorithms or the instructions themselves produce. And so I think one of the things this is telling you, it's like where the artist puts their signature is kind of a statement of intent about where they think the, let's say, creative labor or the creative value is going, if one can separate or associate those two things, rather than the outputs themselves. And I think that's also interesting. Maybe it's a little bit different than what we see with the token world, where it kind of seems now that the token is the art. I've heard people say that, some of the people early in the NFT world, where we're now talking about the token as the apotheosis of everything. Whereas I suppose in SolidWit's case, by signing the instructions, we're saying that more the process, the conception of the creative labor is where the work should be centered, the attention of the work should be centered. So yeah, what we're kind of playing at here, what we're picking at, is this tension, this gray zone between possession, access, and authenticity. And so, yeah, the implication here is that the value lies in the concept. And I just thought I'd pick up a couple of more interesting examples that have something to do a bit more with rights. And so in 2015, probably most of you heard about this, the Wu-Tang Clan had a one-of-one record, a record which they made in secret, which they pressed one copy of, put in a bank vault, and they were auctioning it And the idea was that nobody would be able to hear this except the person, the owner. And so it was bought by a noted fraudster that's just on their way out of prison. And once it got impounded, it got sold on to a DAO, or sold on to one of these crypto organizations. So I think there's some kind of like, again, circular logic here. And at the bottom of the slide, so the picture on the left is the case, the kind of whatever enameled case this exclusive object is housed in. And I suppose that is an enclosure, a bit like tokens are the enclosure of the artwork in the digital milieu. And at the bottom of the slide, there's this thing, a picture of this kind of comic, and it says Spiced Out on it. And so you probably know about the Dune film, which came out not so long ago. That was based on a sci-fi book series from the late 20th century. And in the process of trying to get that made into films, the surrealist filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky and Mobius, the deceased graphic novelist, made this massive book, like a kind of graphic novel of the film, which they were shopping around to film studios. And it never got made into a film, that one. It kind of, that production fell apart, and David Lynch was brought in to rescue it. And that's what the 84 or the mid-80s film is that's where that came from. But some people, some kind of well-meaning, naive crypto people, thought they could buy a copy of this kind of storyboard comic book, and they thought that would give them the rights to actually make the movie. And that was like, so they overbid, I believe, 100 times more than the reserve price on the auction to get this thing. So they made a DAO to collectively pool funds to bid on this thing, and they got it. They paid way too much for it, and they thought they could make a movie after that, having not realized that the rights to make a movie did not come with the book that people were using to shop the making of a movie 40 years ago. So anyway, there's something about, like, even people inside the space don't really know what they're buying or what the rights they're acquiring are. So like, just like caveat emptor, be careful with these kinds of things. This is my favorite slide of the talk. So you might have heard of the Kunstlerscheiße, Manzoni's artist shit, where there was, I believe, I can't remember the number of editions, 32, 64 maybe. And it's the artist's excrement sealed and put in a can and numbered. And I think this is actually quite close to, and it's like a material version of an NFT right here. And so I've equated this to the, you see this like very psychedelic simian fellow on the right of the screen. And this is from what's called the Bored Ape Yacht Club, which I suppose is the premier, in terms of economic, in terms of financial value, big ticket money, it's a premier NFT series around. And these things sell for huge amounts of money, tens of billions of dollars. Although they're not selling for as much as they did a few weeks ago. So it could be that these things are, people are realizing the contents of them don't smell as sweetly as they had hoped, much like the Kunstlerscheiße. So let's say something about ownership now. And so we're all artists, except for me. But I make some art. So let's say I made some art and I want to tokenize it. Doesn't matter what it is. Could be poem, could be music, could be video, visual art, GAN image, doesn't matter. So what do you own? What do you own? So I make a token. I make 100 NFTs of the video that you saw playing at the start of the lecture. And Yol buys one of them. And so what does that mean? Does Yol own the artwork now? Or does he just have this kind of token of appreciation, or this kind of like memoriam, or the certificate that says, I participated, I met the artist, I funded, I paid for a coffee of the artist. And like we talked about this Dune situation around IP, royalties, broadcast rights. And so you can think of a token in the most general sense here. You could think of an NFT or even just any other kind of cryptographic token as a series of rights and affordances. Like it's a series of keys. It's like a keychain in your pocket. It lets you access a bunch of stuff, it lets you control a bunch of stuff, it lets you do a bunch of stuff. But if I have a key, so for example, I'm at my art residency in Copenhagen right now, and I have a key to the door, does that mean I own the building? Probably not, according to Danish law anyway. But I have access to it, so I can access the building. I can come and go as I please, but I don't think I own it. And I think an NFT is actually quite a good example of that. You have access, you have proximity, you can interact with it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have like bedrock ownership of the thing. So yeah, we've heard this one from some people that founded some of the projects we're going to talk about later as examples in the space. The token is the artwork. And this is a good one because it's reminding you that the token is the thing that's at center stage here. So if you don't like the token, then don't buy it. Like, that's the value should be housed within the token, not within the kind of the ephemera that are surrounding it. So yes, we can think of NFTs as digital enclosures, as wrappers for a quantum of spectacle. And there was this project by the NBA, the basketball thing in America, and they did this thing called Top Shots, which is kind of like, whoever Michael Jordan does a slam dunk, and there's a 3-second video clip of that on Twitter. They now make that into an NFT, and then you own the moment that the big slam dunk happened. And there's nothing much arty about that, but it does seem to be this kind of like tokenized moment. We're tokenizing some spectacle. People are kind of owning a piece of the action. What that reminds me a bit of is when you go to the theme park with your family or your friends, you go down the log plume and you're like, oh, or the roller coaster, and they take a picture of you, and then you see that later. And NFT is kind of like that tokenized moment. But there's a tension here, and we just mentioned it when we talked about the Solowit wall drawings, which is that it seems that in this NFT moment, all that is really being valued by the market is the token, is the objects, the output of this process. So all of the conceptual, creative, technical work seems to have been negated. That just seems to be ignored, vanished. And so that seems like an unhealthy development to me, because it's kind of abstracting away the life of the artist from the token and from the market. Some people see NFTs as a return to patronage in a good way. Like if you like an artist, you can support them directly by buying their tokens. I would say that in some ways that is true, and it is obviously different than the patronage of old. But it's this very disconnected patronage. You don't really have much to do with, a lot of the time in the old days, the patrons would be very close to the artists, maybe almost performing kind of pastoral elements of care for them, almost like, somebody that's looking out for them, a guardian angel or something like that. I don't think owners of NFTs can be considered guardian angels to the artists that are producing them these days. And so one of the questions I ask myself is this the kind of the pornification of creative labor? Have we turned it into this kind of like, we cheapened it and debased it to the point where it's kind of valueless? One of the things we've noticed with the internet age is that the price of immaterial goods tends towards zero over time. Happen with news, happen with email, happen with whatever social stuff. Everything seems to be free on the internet, and that is a worrying trend for people that need to make their living from the wares and the craft they ply in digital spaces. While on the topic of ownership, I think there's something interesting going on here where we can kind of connect the real and the virtual, and we can talk about metaphysical arbitrage of sorts. And there's two examples, I think, here. And one of them is Banksy. So there was a Banksy work which was burnt. You can see the picture in the bottom right of the screen. And it was, as it was being burnt, it was a live stream, and they burnt that and they tokenized it. And the token was worth more than the art they bought and destroyed. That might be a function of when they did it and the level of speculative hype in the market. But I think it's an interesting point that, once you've destroyed the artwork and tokenized it, what does the token represent here? What do people actually, buy? And Damien Hirst had a project called The Currency, which came out last year, where people would get these kind of polka dot things that are on the screen. They look like banknotes. They're all unique. And after a while, you'd have to decide, do you keep the paper object and get the token, or do you destroy the paper object? Or you basically can keep one. either the paper object or the token, and you have to decide. So this is kind of Faustian bargain, like you're being asked to make a deal with the devil, and you have to decide which of these value forms, either from a speculative perspective or from a appreciation of a hot perspective, do you want to hold on to? And the reason I mentioned Schumpeter at the top of the slide is because this all seems like creative destruction that the economist Schumpeter spoke about. It's kind of like tides of capital kind of destroying and remaking things in its image. And it seems that this idea of destroying things in the real world to give them these kind of virtual simulacra seems to be on that tip. So here's the question for us: like, what does a token represent once the object is absent, it's been destroyed, or it never existed, or whatever? What we have is the spectacle, this intervention that we've performed, this aura of this aesthetic process, or even a cryptographic vibe. So, and I think this is like, we're going to talk a bit about why now, and I think this is probably one of the most relevant things to the moment of today. And like, well, we're still pretty much in a pandemic, I suppose. And, for the last 2 years, we're still on Zoom here. We're still heads on sticks on Zoom. And so for the last 2 years, a lot of aspects of the real world had to go on ice for a while, right? We couldn't travel, couldn't even leave our houses, couldn't go to university. And it was the same for the art world, right? Galleries, art fairs, biennales, everything got scaled back, virtualized, made into a Zoom call or whatever. And so, this stasis meant that like everyone was just basically sitting around in cyberspace. And so it kind of makes sense that as our lives, especially, well, let's say the more privileged ones among us, we're living this kind of like increasingly technologized lives at home during the pandemic with VR or podcasting or whatever, Pelotons and all that kind of stuff. It makes sense that also creators are stuck at home and many people couldn't do the things that they would normally do to make a living. It makes sense that we'd look for an answer, a way out in technology, and enter NFTs, I suppose. I will just say that very few people in the crypto art space or even the wider crypto space saw this coming. I've got friends that were incredibly focused on NFTs from 2016 until now, did not see this coming, did not even keep many of their own tokens behind, which you would have done if you'd have thought that there was going to be a, future interest in this thing. A lot of these people were kind of living hand to mouth, having trouble paying the rent and things like that. So it caught a lot of us by surprise. I would say that, there's perhaps something a little bit darker or more concerning at, fueling this move. And on the right is an article from Palladium magazine, which I think everybody, well, if you're interested, I recommend reading it. It's called When the Stagnation Goes Virtual by Ginevra Davis. And it's about a person that doesn't have much to do with the crypto space. And they went to visit NFT NYC, this kind of week-long festival of tokens. And what they saw was this kind of really worrying strain of nihilism that undercut this gold rush into the metaverse, into this kind of persistent digital world that everyone is hawking and telling us is the future now. And the implicit in this drive towards the metaverse, towards this kind of like simulacrization of our lives, is a giving up on the outside, a rejection of the corporeal. So this is kind of like a really shitty post-humanism, if you ask me. And so, yeah, one might even go as far as to call this incelerationism. And so, with that, I will move on. So, yeah, let's think about cui bono. Who gains from all of this? Because, these are market phenomena. Markets usually kind of, there's winners and losers in the market, and often things split down over the axis of information asymmetry. One person or participant in the market, group of participants, knowing more than another. And then the market is kind of this mechanism by which value is redistributed according to levels of information. So markets are not fair. They're not, despite what libertarians might tell you. They are designed to redistribute wealth. And so, seeing as everyone's telling us to tokenize everything and rush in while we do that, why, should we? Does it mean we should? Can we, how can we figure out which opinions are worth listening to, and which ones we should take with a grain of salt? Should we move fast and break things when the things are our careers, precarious people, creative people's livelihoods? Can cryptography, through this enforcement of digital scarcity, make up for the failures of, the art world, galleries, biennales, and that rampant inequality that we see all around us? Will this idea of emancipation and creative liberation really come through? Or are we building castles or even pyramid schemes in the sand once again? So let's start with some of the good things. Let's start with the good news. Blockchains and NFTs might give us new ways of overcoming some of this gatekeeping and structural inequality. We can use smart contracts, kind of like programmatic logics, automated scripts, you could say, to make possible or make it much easier the distribution of value throughout a project. So imagine a complicated art project with 50 participants, each of which is due some varying proportion of royalty. We could set up a contract that automatically funnels money to those people at predetermined intervals, or when a payment comes in, or when the transaction fees on the blockchain are relatively low, something like that. Because these things are illegal and borderless, these are decentralized technologies, at least the permissionless blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum are, they're not so weighed down by the laws of nation states. And so, especially when you have kind of multinational collaborations, as I'm sure many kind of big ticket art projects are these days, you don't have to do 2-week bank transfers to Brazil and the money gets returned because you didn't submit the right kind of ID. You need a wire number to send this thing into the States. You have the wrong passport. You can't transact with the States. Those problems start to go away. We can imagine in this kind of metaverse moment that tokens will give us kind of long-lived registries of information for persistent avatars and identities. We've seen for several years now that raising money, venture funding, is much easier using blockchains. Whether that's good or bad is another matter, but it seems easier. We have lowers operating costs for kind of versus traditional modes of operation. You don't need to seek permission from anybody. So this sounds great, right? Sounds like a dream. But coming back to Earth, like the utopia which we were promised, seems to be a little bit less equitable than we'd hoped for. The 7-year Ethereum of today, which 90% of crypto art is built on, is still very much an experiment. And the other 10% is built on things which are even more of an experiment, like Solana or Cardano or Tezos. They're even newer and even more of an experiment. The programming language inside Ethereum, is unfit for purpose and is due to be retired. But to retire, to upgrade something that can't be switched off is really, really hard. So that's kind of where we are now. And we'll just say something about this very important point at the bottom of the screen about blockchain gentrification. Because the space inside the blocks, inside the ledger of these networks is the precious resource, it is marketized to the hilt, which means that if you want to have a transaction confirmed quickly, go into a block quickly, so it enters the permanent record, you need to pay more than the other people doing it. So this starts off these massive bidding wars. And there was a story recently where the Bored Ape people made a new project, and it completely congested the Ethereum blockchain. The whole blockchain got completely swamped by the demand from just this one project. And so what that tells you is the projects that are more financialized, they can pay more. And those ones will outcompete the more altruistic or the less speculative ones. That's kind of first we saw it with Bitcoin. Now we're seeing with Ethereum. I think it's kind of, what can you say, inevitability if these things become victims of their own success. And so, yeah, I basically just said that. So I won't labor that point too much. let's say something about regulation, because I'm sure you've noticed in the news, people are always talking about these things look like they're not being regulated, or it's like a Wild West, or some guy went to jail because he did something bad. It's usually a guy. And so there is this mismatch, structural mismatch between the way these networks operate, this kind of illegal, borderless, anyone can transact, anyone can access, and the laws of men and nation states. And so because people and capital can move around very easily, different nation states are applying different approaches to this stuff. So some have enticed people in with promises of no taxes or low taxes, and others have kind of put the hammer down. But what's interesting is one of the countries which lured a lot of crypto people to it recently, just today mentioned that they might start taxing them. They said they weren't going to tax them. Loads of people moved there. Now they're going to start taxing them. So that's interesting. Anyway, I don't want to say too much about that. And there's just a tweet on the right that I made, which I think actually sums up blockchains from an art perspective quite well. That we could think of blockchains as jurisdictionless free ports. We know about free ports in the art world, these places where transactions happen, art never leaves these hangars in airports. And it's happening like for tax efficiency, they're tax sheltered. So blockchains are kind of like virtualized free ports. So yeah, let's talk about pyramids. Like, so we live in a society, it kind of looks like a pyramid. It's more important people above us and so on. And so the NFT market seems to reproduce a lot of the existing inequalities. A lot of that is because many of the big players in the NFT space were big players in the Ethereum space to start with. And so it was a very undiverse group of people, let's say. So yeah, I'm aware that we've been going for quite a while. So I want to make sure we cover some examples and the history of these things before we go to Q&A. And so here's a potted history of the first, let's say, 5 years before everything went crazy. So in 2012, somebody figured out that on Bitcoin, if you changed one of the parameters, you could kind of mark the coin. A bit like you put a Sharpie on your banknote, you've changed it. Now it's non-fungible. It doesn't look the same as the other ones. So that's what we call colored coins. People made kind of pseudo tokens on Bitcoin using that. In 2014, there were a series of meta protocols built on Bitcoin. Counterparty was one, Scribe was another, and those were to kind of make assets on top of Bitcoin. And then we started seeing the first few kind of art game projects in 2015, Spells of Genesis, Force of Will, and then we had the controversial green frog, the rare Pepe, appeared on the Bitcoin blockchain in 2016. And then in 2017, we started seeing things on Ethereum, things that we see now, we still see today, CryptoKitties, CryptoPunks. They started appearing. And then it was kind of the floodgates. So I won't go too much into the later history, but I just want to show you a couple of the examples of what's come before. So Scribe and Monograph were early platforms that were trying to make kind of art possibilities for artists on the Bitcoin blockchain. And Monograph is still going. Scribe mutated into BigChainDB, which is now Ocean protocol. But yeah, so this is like early stage experiments in trying to build protocols and tools for artists to use the blockchain. On the left is Quantum by Kevin McCoy, which is like, some people say it was the first NFT. It's a bit hard to say what was the first NFT because there are many things which have the characteristics of NFTs, which weren't in the same kind of structural logic that we see today. This is a game called Spells of Genesis, which is a bit like Magic the Gathering, one of these collectible card games, where each card was an NFT, and that was on top of Bitcoin. You could play this game on chain. So you just use transactions to play the game. But that means every time you play a card, that's a transaction on Bitcoin. And in 2015, that was cheap. Now it's not cheap. So you can't play this game on Bitcoin anymore. It's too expensive. Here's my absolute favorite crypto art project called Bitcorn, and not to be confused with Bitcoin. And this is an agrarian futurism community where they're trying to imagine through memes and shitposting a world beyond speculation, beyond value. I highly recommend you check this project out. Full disclosure, I have a Bitcoin farm. It's like the only crypto art project I participate in. And I mostly like it because of the memes and the wordplay. But what I saw in this community was something that was more concerned with shitposting and camaraderie than speculation and greed. And that was like a nice harken back to the early days of crypto, the kind of spirit of inquiry rather than the spirit of we're all going to get rich. So yes, more corn related stuff. And then here we go to the, some of the things we see today. So the punks are still around. They're some of the most expensive NFTs that exist. And the kitties, well, they didn't flourish in the same way. And I think that might be because the kitties breed. So the supply of the kitties was less scarce than the punks. So punks were treated really as these kind of like scarce collectibles, whereas the kitties, I suppose, were a bit more of a playable game, something like that. And then this is kind of, I suppose, I don't want to call it the state of the art, but this is one of the biggest projects today. It's not my favorite, but it is important. And that's the Bored Ape Yacht Club. And yeah, it's all a bunch of pictures of monkeys. And there's nothing very interesting technically going on with this project. It's just a bunch of pictures of monkeys, some of which trade for billions of dollars. So if that's your thing, good luck to you. And there's many copycat projects like this out there now. So here's just an idea of the kind of the boomtown, the kind of ecosystem that is taking shape across NFTs. And probably since the time that slide was made, there's way more now. And so I want to say something about interesting projects that we see today, because I think that's a good place to look forwards. And so we have this new medium in which we can make art, amongst other things. And so for me, the most interesting works are the ones which leverage the novel possibilities, aesthetics, imaginaries, economic modes, and ecological intertwinings of the medium itself. I'll give you a few examples. So there's one by the artist Sarah Friend called Life Forms, which is a series of tokens where there's no limit to the supply. So they're not really valuable. There's no secondary market. Anyone can mint them, so you can print one yourself. But if you don't transfer it to somebody else within 90 days, it dies. And so this is now like a thing that is a gift. And you have to, the way you look after it is by paying it forwards. So this is kind of giving you an insight into a post-capitalist imaginary, one where we're sharing and paying it forwards rather than hoarding and keeping it back. Terra Zero, the early land art project, had an NFT called 2 Degrees, which was basically an NFT contract, smart contract, issuing a token linked to a temperature oracle, which if that temperature oracle moved up 2 degrees from the birth of the project, the NFT would destroy itself. Let's say something about nascent time zone 4. And so there's like blockchains are these kind of data paradises. There's kind of all this like stochastic processes occurring, creating information, hashes of blocks, transactions, the time between blocks, all kinds of stuff. Beyond the scope of our talk today, you can use some of this data to generate art, and you can actually do some of that on chain. You can render the stuff natively in some of these networks, and you can create art which is endlessly evolving, even like native to this pocket calculator strength computer that Ethereum actually is. So you can create works that are endlessly evolving. And I want to say something about Kudzu, which is a fun project by a few friends of mine in Berlin, which is like an NFT virus. So this is a token which you can't buy. Anyone can mint it, but you can only mint it through the interaction of, you have to interact with somebody else that's got the token to mint it. And once you've got the token, you can't transfer it. It's stuck in your wallet. It's like a bit of chewing gum in your pocket or something on your hair or something like that. You can't transfer it. And so if you imagine that the transfer function is gone, it makes it a bit harder to speculate with, to create a market around. So we're starting to see in art, it's interesting that we're seeing it pretty much only in art, some of these kind of post-capitalist imaginaries starting to appear in the blockchain space. And one of the last things I want to mention in terms of exemplars is Sarah Friend's Off, which so it's a series of 255 black oblongs, like in the shape of different devices. Oh, you can't see my phone. such as phones and laptop screens. And the idea is that each one of those NFTs also contains a fragment of a key, a cryptographic key, which 2/3 of the owners of the collection must collaborate on to unlock a secret piece of content. So then this is turning the would-be kind of atomized kind of neoliberal art collector into somebody that has to seek collaboration to realize the ultimate value of the work. I think that's also very interesting. So that's just a map of the virus of kudzu breaking out across social graphs. And so, yeah, well, I'm coming towards the end. I know we've been going for quite a while, but I just want to say something about environment and ecological implications of these networks, because I know that's on a lot of our minds these days. And I will just say that like the discourse is very polarized on this stuff. On the left, we have a lot of kind of hand-wringing, I would say. And on the right, we have kind of this kind of libertarian, screw that, let the market decide. And like, I would say that the reality is probably in the middle somewhere. So I want to introduce this concept of tokenization marginality. And so proof of work networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum that do this mining, like to find each block, they're using loads of energy, regardless of whether any tokens are being made or not. It takes loads of energy just to keep the lights on. Think of a plane traveling from one city to another. Even if the plane's empty of passengers, still requires fuel. So that's kind of an interesting analogy here for us. And so because so much energy is required just to keep the lights on, the marginal energy of you tokenizing a project versus not tokenizing it is actually very small. And so if you take that in mind, I think a lot of the ideas of boycotting certain networks because they're ecologically unfriendly seems to be less effective or less meaningful than with a signaling value there, but it may not be that effective in terms of saving the planet or reducing emissions or something like that. And that, I suppose, is a bit like when a big name artist says, oh, I'm not going to take planes anymore to go to the Biennale. That's fine. They signaled, they will get plaudits in the press, but it might not change the ultimate reality of the planetary situation we're in now. So yeah, we just said this basically. And we all talk about these alternatives to proof of work, these new networks that don't use the mining. Proof of stake is this very popular alternative. So let me just quickly say what proof of stake is compared to proof of work. Proof of work is where you burn electricity doing computation to secure the network and to find new blocks and push it forwards. In proof of stake, we take stake, which are coins, like your tokens at the poker table or something like that. That's your stake, and you render them illiquid. You lock them up, and that's the virtual resource that's simulating the real resource of energy being burnt. But there are a whole bunch of kind of potential vulnerabilities with this system because of the lack of an expensive resource being consumed. And so there's all these mitigations which get applied in proof of stake. And a lot of them come at the expense of what we think of as permissionlessness or decentralization. So basically we come back towards authority models of these networks. And so basically there's a person in charge and they decide whether you can transact or not. And like, I kind of thought we were getting away from that. I thought that was what the point of these things were. But anyway, it takes all sorts to bake a cake, I suppose. And so one of the main problems with proof of stake is it's an inherently financialized system. And so it's been formally proven that unless you take a great deal of care, the rich get richer. And the people that understand how the networks work, they're the ones that benefit. And so that's the problem with proof of work. It's also not proven at scale, computationally or economically. So let's see. Ethereum is meant to move to proof of stake anytime now. We've been waiting for 7 years for it to happen. Let's see how it goes. And so here's just something about emissions, particularly to do with Ethereum. You can see the number is going up. That is megatons of carbon dioxide per year. And so these are now like numbers that move the needle on a global scale. And so Ethereum is committed to leave proof of work, but that's not to say that some people won't continue the original trajectory of Ethereum, try to continue the mining. There might actually be like a split where there's one version of Ethereum which leaves mining and one which stays on it. But anyway, that's a subject for another day. And I just want to kind of wrap by recapping a little bit and pointing a little bit towards the future. Like, we live in a society and it is scarcity based, whether we like it or not. We jumped into, through the pandemic, we jumped into this token art world so quickly. It seems like we've replicated a lot of what we've already seen. And I think in the wider blockchain space, we also see replications of kind of market and capitalistic logics that we already have, we're trying to get away from. So I would say this doesn't look like a paradigm shift so much. It's more of a kind of it's an iteration or a continuation. And so, the gentrification of cyberspace continues apace. And, we have this kind of never-ending complexity with using blockchains, which makes them very hard to use, but also there's all these things that happen on them that just don't happen other places. So unless you know what's going on, you're consistently getting caught out. I have so many examples of all of that. So, but let's end on a positive note, because we have to imagine a future somehow. So we can imagine new kinds of works of art that could not have been possible before. Novel coordination games like Zero Friends Off, challenging atomized parties to organize, uniting in search of and pursuit of a higher goal. And let's remember that we can use these tools to create new kinds of creator economies, facilitate novel forms of collaboration, and opening up new modes of collecting and sharing that run contrary to the present distribution of entrenched power. And it's in those possibilities, not in this speculative fervor of the gentrified cyberspace mania that we're seeing these days, that we might ultimately find a truly revolutionary cause within this NFT, token art, crypto and blockchain world that's worth fighting for. And thanks very much for your time.
Wassim, wow, thank you so much for this very broad and yet very focused interrogation of these blockchains and NFTs and DAOs and systems of addressing and histories of maintaining power and ownership. It's really so incredible and beautifully presented. We have one question in the chat, and I would like to invite that person, if they would like to turn on their camera and just ask Wassim directly your question. Ollie Zhang.
Hi, Wassim. Can you see me? Yeah. Hi. Nice to see you. Thanks for the talk. Let's see. I don't think I can be as succinct as I was when I wrote my question out. But yeah, so thinking about NFTs, like you mentioned, as a form of enclosure and how that differs from kind of historical precedents of enclosure, and that so they lack the right to exclude, which I guess is like a really strong function of what we tend to conceive of as ownership, or like a strong sense of ownership. I wonder if there is a less harmful version of enclosure at play here, because something I think about a lot is like there's this essay by Anna Ting called On Non-Scalability, where she talks about the harms of scalability lying in their how they erode meaningful diversities. But I think, in the ruins of, capitalist scalability, for instance, can there be an emancipatory scalability? So likewise, I think that seems super contradictory maybe, but can there be a mildly emancipatory form of enclosure at play here? Can there be a less harmful one? Can it be a non-reformist form? Just kind of curious about your thoughts on that.
I hope so, Ollie. Yeah, thanks for coming, by the way. Nice to see you. I hope so. I would very much like it to be the case. However, I feel like it might actually be kind of tilting the other way. So I think we talk about NFTs being kind of enclosures for whatever the creative object labor or the art process. And we have to remember that the NFT lives on a blockchain, and the blockchain is itself another kind of enclosing logic, where the network is kind of like a token gated community, I guess you could say. And so we have these kind of boundaries in Bitcoin and Ethereum. Those are kind of policed by cryptography and thermodynamics. And so you kind of need the tokens to play inside the sandpit. And so I hope that we can imagine more generous forms of or new hybrid forms of public and less exclusionary forms of enclosure. But I also have a feeling, because we live in this kind of techno-libertarian sandbox that I think crypto seems to pretty much be, is that we'll see every flavor of things going the other way. And just to give you a little bit of a heads up, one of the fellows at the Zurich Salon is currently writing a manuscript called Hyperenclosure, which is about precisely this. But I can imagine, and this is kind of a common point, which you should hold all of my thoughts in, is that we could imagine new networks, new forms, new organizational logics that might exist in the future that aren't possible or we haven't seen yet in things like Bitcoin, Ethereum, the things we have today, which might give us these more generous forms of access and collaboration. So yeah, I am hopeful, Ollie, but I have mostly seen things tending to go in the other direction.
Cool, thank you.
And we have a question also from Clara, who has her hand up if she'd like to unmute and turn the video.
Hello, can you see me or?
Yeah, I can hear you, see you, yep.
Okay. So I have a question about the utopian dimension you were saying is possible, but not, we're not veering that way. I guess what I don't understand is where the potentiality necessarily comes from. You began the talk talking about the fact that the state seized some of your family's assets unjustifiably in your youth, and how that it seemed like a nice solution, that arbitrary taking of assets couldn't be done, and that this is an alternative to that. But in practice, then to think about it, wouldn't the reverse just be the case? Either it would be the case that assets are seizable and we can, or to flip that, either it would be the case, wouldn't it be the case that assets are seizable and then people can just hide money from the state, or it would be the reverse, that it's the same thing as any asset where it's seizable. And in that same dimension, let's say, the utopian potential for a cryptocurrency to function as a normal currency of an exchangeable currency. Wouldn't it either be the case that it would function in the same way that money does, or it would be unregulatable and untraceable? And it seems like now it's already an asset that's traceable and functions in the realm of the state regardless, in the way that any asset does. It's being taxed, it's being regulated. There was just I think like a $5 billion heist or something that happened with crypto, where it was just easier for the state to track it down, because as soon as that money was spent, you could look into the blockchain and see where it came from. And then functioning as money, these currencies don't function well as money because they're not stable. So if an artist one day was paid in Ethereum, let's say 2 months ago, right now their cash would be worth half as much. So isn't even toying in this realm pretty destructive and maybe even risky for the financial future of artists? And I just don't see where like you said, the potential for future collaborations and utopian, I guess, positivism of the past, like, wasn't that all just kind of misguided in the first place? That's my question.
Okay, there's a lot to go on here. Thanks very much. So yeah, firstly, I just want to make sure that we understand that there's more than one kind of phenomena at play here. And it's very easy to kind of talk about things in the, like, of crypto, of blockchain. And we talk about kind of things in a sweeping way. Whereas I would say that there are at least several different, by now anyway, several different partially related phenomena carrying on. One of them is Bitcoin. Bitcoin's kind of out on its own, doing its thing. It's kind of a bit dumb, no frills, relatively simple system. And it's just trying to do one thing quite well, which is this kind of secure digital value transfer. And so is that thing that I saw this emancipatory potential in specifically 10 years ago. I would say that, like, my kind of hopes for emancipation, liberation from these technologies, which, by the way, if you look up the project Reaching Everyone by Parallel Industries, you'll find essentially a decolonial Bitcoin praxis project that I was doing 3 to 5 years ago, where I was building prototypes of wallets for refugees and migrants, things like that. So I genuinely believe we could use these systems for people that the world, that the other systems have failed them. I still think that there is a place for Bitcoin as this kind of money of last resort, money of enemies kind of thing. But it does kind of point the way towards this very low trust environment, which is kind of an unpleasant, kind of scorched earth imaginary to imagine ourselves in. You talked about exchangeability, regulation, traceability. I would also say that these things are different depending on, which network we're talking about here. But certainly Bitcoin, Ethereum, everything is very traceable. When you have these blockchain forensic firms like Chainalysis that are tracking stuff down. I believe it was Chainalysis that found the Bitfinex hackers, which was the 5 billion heist, I think, that you mentioned. That was, I think, those coins were taken in 2015, and they only just found the people because they only just started spending the coins. And so actually, we talk about Bitcoin being this libertarian paradise, but it's very heavily surveilled, the blockchain. And it's very hard to do privacy. You can do a bit of privacy on Bitcoin. There are things like coin mixing, where people are trying to obfuscate the genesis, the origin of coins. There are even things like privacy preserving layer 2 protocols, which kind of live on top of the core Bitcoin network. But yeah, none of these are perfect. And so one of the worries is that, all these freedom loving people think they're using this thing and they're kind of sticking it to the government, but actually they're being surveilled way more closely than they could have ever been done. Nothing beats paper cash, really. The only problem with paper cash is I need to meet you in meat space to give it to you. And so we can't conduct business over the cyberspace or the second realm. With regulation, also kind of it's very different how the regulators see different things. So Bitcoin, they see like a commodity, speculative asset. A lot of the tokens they see like securities, they look like stocks, penny stocks, basically. So they would be regulated in a different way. And then NFTs look different still. So I actually spent a lot of time between 2017 and 2019 building a regulatory framework, philosophical framework for regulators to try and disentangle these different kinds of tokens. And that was called the token space, if you're curious. But yeah, we still have this mismatch between the regulation of nations and people and these kind of like whatever free-flowing networks. The last thing you mentioned, I think, was about the quality of these things as money due to their lack of value stability. And I would say that yes, indeed, things like Bitcoin and Ethereum are very volatile in terms of their value, and holding them as an artist or as a kind of precarious creator is risky. It's definitely risky. And so that's why a lot of people, they tend to turn them into pounds, euros, dollars. As soon as they get them, they convert them. And so that's one way you can.
The hilarious part of it, like
yeah. So it's because like to create a circular economy out of these things, while they're so unstable in value, is very difficult. If you listen to Bitcoiners, they will tell you that the volatility will recede in a few generations. So you just hold on to your coins for 100 years, and then everything will be fine. And so that's what they tell themselves. But in reality, on the street, I've got some money in my pocket and I want to buy a cup of coffee. these things are not great for that.
But even if the value acceded in 100 years, that wouldn't be an example of a quality idea of money, because money is supposed to be, or at least in the neoliberal era, it's supposed to be a stable, neutral surface that can be used as an exchange, easy way to exchange goods and services. So I just feel like on these three different levels that I pointed out, there's not really a clarification of an idea of the good that comes through this. Like, if we talk about subverting the state, is that necessarily a good thing in the way that it's being described? If we talk about,
I actually tried to stay away from moral. I tried to stay away from.
Thing?
Tried to stay away from moral arguments in general. I don't really feel like making good and bad arguments.
Exactly. But how could you talk about like decentralization as a good if you're not talking about a value judgment in the first place?
Did I say it was good?
What is good about decentralization? What is good about statelessness?
Did I say it was good?
Any advocacy towards a utopic idea.
I'm not an advocate. I'm coming from a place of skepticism. I suggest you read the article, "The Revolution Will Not Be Tokenized." It's on the Zero Exelon website. You find it to be quite, I think, balanced, but quite stringent criticism. I'm not a booster. I'm not boosting these things.
Thanks, Wassim. Thanks, Clara. That was really
funny.
Thank you.
We're just coming at the end of the time here, and I want to thank again. I also read that article, "The Revolution Will Not Be Tokenized," and I had a big long-winded question for you about it that brought in Gil Scott-Heron and Saadia Hartman, but we will leave that for another time. Wassim will be back in a couple weeks, and I think we are going to keep evolving this conversation, and that'll be really, really fantastic. So thank you so much. So thank you so much for this, and
it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks again.
So see you in a couple of weeks, and I think to Clara's points, we will be covering a bit more of like where these things kind of fell short of their promises in a couple of weeks. So hold tight.
Amazing.
All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.